On October 30th, 1993, I picked up the ringing phone, and it was my mother, and she said, "Your father's had a stroke." Knowing that this was his worst fear, I said, "How bad is it?" And she said, "Oh, it's really bad." She said the right side of his face is all lopsided and droopy, and he's completely lost the use of his right hand. He's having a terrible time walking, and when he talks, I can't understand a word he says. And I said, "Oh, Mom, what can I do?" And she said, "Could you please come home?" At that time, I was a single mother with 3 teenage children, and that Friday night was going to be the final football game of the season. Eric, my oldest son, was a senior, and it was going to be Mom's night, so all of the mothers were to go out onto the field, and our sons were to come and hand us each a single red rose. It was also the last time that his brother Robert, who was a junior, and Eric would ever play on the same field at the same time for the same team. And we were, in addition, planning to celebrate my daughter Annie's 15th birthday. So as I thought of all of the reasons that I desperately wanted to stay with my children that weekend, I heard myself saying, "Of course, I'll pack tonight and I'll get on the road the first thing in the morning." And I would imagine that every person in this room has had a similar experience where you had to choose between doing what you really wanted to do for your family or for yourself and what you felt like you had to do for your care receiver. Well, that was my initiation into the club of long-distance caregivers. So the next morning, as I drove the 450 miles from Colorado Springs, where I was living at the time, to McPherson, Kansas, I had a lot of time to think. But even so, I just could not make this work out in my mind. My dad was as healthy and robust as any 75-year-old man on the planet. He was still farming. And men in our family just didn't get sick or die when they were that age. When my Uncle John turned 93 to celebrate his birthday, he went to town to buy himself a new suit. And he told the clerk that he was afraid he was going to wear out the pants before he wore out the jacket, so he ordered 2 identical pair of trousers. Now, the clerk thought this was amusing and wildly optimistic. In our family, it just made good sense. So had it been my dad who called and said something had happened to my mother, I would have been devastated, but I would not have been surprised because although she was only 70, her little body was just nearly worn out. She was losing her vision because of macular degeneration. Her back was hunched with osteoporosis. She had a scar that started at her throat and extended to her breastbone as a result of open heart surgery from which she had not fully recovered. She didn't sleep at night because of her restless leg syndrome, but the thing that was frustrating her beyond all belief was the severe hearing loss that had been brought on as a result of the medication that she was taking for her heart. And now she had 2 choices. She could either take him home and care for him herself, or she could sell homesteaded farm ground and put him into long-term care. Has anybody in here ever known a farmer? Well, if you have, then you will understand when I say my dad loved my mother more than anything in the world except for the land. That's right. So to her, that really was not a choice. So she had to develop some unique coping strategies to deal with her isolation and loneliness and the emotional stress of caring for a husband who was very different from the man she had known and loved and lived with for the last 51 years. And I'm going to tell you what those strategies were, but first I'd like to introduce you to my parents so you can think of them as whole people, not just my parents. And I always called them Mom and Dad, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to refer to them as Madelyn and Quentin. So this is their wedding portrait. They met and fell in love when she was 16, he was 21, when she was still in high school. And they dated until after her graduation, and then Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941. And the day after that happened, Quentin went to enlist in the Army Air Corps, and he was sent to McCord Air Force Base in Tacoma, Washington. And in the summer of 1942, he wrote to Madelyn and he said, "Why don't you get on a train and come out and we'll get married?" So she did. They were married by the Justice of the Peace, and then they had a brief but wonderful honeymoon up at the Paradise Inn on Mount Rainier. And then shortly after the wedding, Quentin was shipped off to the South Pacific, where he fought in World War II for the next 3 years. So when he came home, evidently they were happy to see each other. Because this is what happened over the course of the next 5 years. Now, they lived on a dairy farm, and I can tell you, it was a hard life. There was so much work. There were all of these kids. There was never enough money. And I remember when I used to complain about the smell, my dad would say, "Oh, honey, that's the smell of money." Well, it never smelled like money to me, and I guarantee you it never spent like it either. So the summer I was 9, we had prospects for a really good wheat harvest. There was even talk of taking a vacation that year. And then, as it does in Kansas in the summer, these big, dark clouds started billowing up in the southwest. And we watched this storm approaching with a combination of hope and dread. We knew what was coming, and we just kept praying that somehow our fields would be missed. Well, when the rain started, it came in huge, heavy drops that quickly turned into hailstones about the size of my fist. And it didn't last long. It probably moved through in 15 minutes or less, but by the time it was over, our crops and our source of income for that year were gone. And that was the year that Madelyn realized she hated the farm. She hated the flies, she hated the cows, she hated the smell, and she hated being poor. But she loved Quentin, and she had all of these kids to raise, so she had to figure out a way to make this work. So that summer, she did 2 things that changed her life. She got a job in town, and she became a devotee of self-help books. And every day, shortly after 5 o'clock, she would pull into the driveway, she would rush out of her car into the house, change out of her business clothes into her work clothes, and she would go to the milk barn. And I followed her to the milk barn because I loved to hear her stories and about everything she was reading about faith and the power of positive thinking. And she would have been 37 at the time and quite attractive, although you wouldn't have guessed it had you been there with me in the barn on the night that she told me about Dr. Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Have any of you read this? Okay, so you know the story. But I can still see her standing there. She had black rubber boots up to here, yellow rubber gloves up to here, and she had this funky 3-layer shower cap to keep the manure splatters out of her hair. It was sky blue on the bottom, clear plastic on the top, little white feathers trapped in between, and simulated brass earrings that were hanging down about here. Like I said, I was 9, and I knew that this was a tragic fashion choice. But as she was dipping this rag into a bucket of soapy water and then washing the manure off of the cow's teats, she was telling me about Dr. Frankl and how when the Nazis had taken him, he had already lost his family, his home, and his business. And when he got off of the train at Auschwitz, the only things that he had remaining were the clothes on his back and a suitcase in which he was carrying a manuscript for a book that he had been working on for 10 years. Well, they took the suitcase and threw it on a pile. Then they took his clothes, and then they proceeded to shave every single hair off his body. And that was the beginning of 4 years of systematic degradation, humiliation, and control. And he said about halfway through this experience, he realized that it wasn't always the youngest, the healthiest, or the strongest people who were surviving. Now, granted, nobody has any defense against a gas chamber or dysentery, but for the people who were in the work camp, he said the difference was attitude. And he said he realized you can take away every single choice a person has. You can take away every single freedom, which is the last freedom, and that is for a person to be able to choose his or her attitude toward any given set of circumstances. Viktor Frankl became Madelyn's hero. She knew that she couldn't control the weather. She knew that she would never have any power or authority over what they were going to get paid for their milk, wheat, milo, or corn. But she believed, like Dr. Frankl, she could become the master of her own mind and she could control her thinking. So, over the course of the next 30 years, she had a lot of opportunities to control her thinking, being on a farm and raising 4 children and being married to a farmer who was always optimistic and never really brought anything in that spent like money. So this is Madelyn and Quentin on their 50th wedding anniversary, and this was just a year before Quentin had his stroke. So she looks pretty good there. You don't see all of her physical struggles, but imagine what it was like now taking care of him. He weighed about 200 pounds, and she said it was like taking care of a 200-pound infant most of the time. So one of the things that she did to manage her emotional stress is that she would disengage her emotional monitor. She would go to her computer and she would write letters to me in which she expressed everything she was experiencing and exactly how she felt about it. So I saved all of those letters, and I ended up editing them into the book, Letters from Madelyn, Chronicles of a Caregiver. And I want to share with you now the story or the letter that started all of this. I was asked to speak at our church on Mother's Day about mother-daughter relationships, and I thought I wanted to introduce my mother to people in her own words. So I went out to the garage, I took down a large cardboard moving box that my husband had labeled Letters from Madelyn. And I started looking for this letter. Now I imagine the day that she wrote it, she would have just finished breakfast and she would have been wearing her apron, because she always wore an apron, because if you wear an apron, your clothes don't get dirty, you don't have to wash them as often, and they don't wear out. And she would have been standing at the sink washing the dishes and then slamming them into the drainer. And at some point, she would have realized that she had 2 choices. She could either stand there and explode, or she could go to the computer and write. So this is what she had to say. Dear Elaine, I am so upset over the advice that is being given to people today about doing your own thing and to hell with everybody else. And I think that's the reason that there's so many divorces and so much unhappiness right now. And I think Dr. Wayne Dyer had a lot to do with this when he wrote this book, Your Erroneous Zones. I bought this book and I started reading it, and I got so angry and up on my high horse I just had to put it down. There were 2 things that upset me about that book. The first thing is, I don't think he understands that there are 2 genders. Seems to me he's only aware of the male. And then the second thing is that he just keeps pounding away at this idea that a person should do what he or she wants to do. So, an old lady, I'm here to tell anyone who will listen that life is not made up of doing what you want to do. Thank goodness I have learned how to find my own peace and happiness from within, because I can't see anything that's all that exciting or invigorating about getting up in the morning and fixing breakfast and then doing the dishes and then starting a load of laundry and then helping your father and running the sweeper and picking up the papers and then going back and fixing lunch and doing the dishes and doing more laundry and more housework and helping your father. For me, an exciting day might consist of running into somebody I know in the grocery store or on the street, or possibly having an interesting telephone conversation. And for this I should take vitamins? I should eat right and exercise so I can prolong this wonderful life experience? No, give me a break. My joy in life comes from learning and growing mentally and spiritually. And the thing that I've learned about having my own peace and happiness from within is that I can stay more or less emotionally detached and still do what has to be done to give other people a reasonable amount of happiness. So, this detached attitude eventually morphed into what she called an attitude of creative indifference. And I asked her one time, I said, so what's the difference between being detached and being creatively indifferent? And she said, oh, same thing. You can call it whatever you want to call it. She said, I just like the term creative indifference better because I think detached sounds a little cold. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but what it means is not allowing yourself to become emotionally ravaged by the disease or the progression of events. So, as I edited her letters, I realized that she did 3 things consistently. When something was upsetting her, she would sit down and she would write about it. And so Alex and I, as we have developed these programs, believe that there are a lot of really effective ways to become aware of issues, including support groups and counseling. But I think that starting by writing something down really helps bring clarity to it so that you can look at it objectively. The second step is acceptance, and I think this must be the most difficult thing that caregivers have to deal with because we want a solution to every problem. We want a cure for every illness, and sometimes it's not going to work out the way we want it to. Accepting that and accepting that there are a lot of contributing and complicating factors to every situation is hard. And it takes a lot of courage to face what you have to face and make the adaptations as you go along. And then the third step is action, and there are 2 parts to this. If you can identify a problem and you can identify a solution, that's awesome. You make a plan, you execute the plan, and you solve the problem, right? More often than not, when caregivers are looking at problems, they are problems for which there are not a lot of solutions. So then when you look at that and you say, do I have any power, authority, or control over this? If the answer is no, then you have the choice of either obsessing over it or releasing your emotional attachment to it. Does that make sense? We're going to be doing workshops the rest of this week. We'll be doing another one here, a full-day thing on Wednesday. So if you're interested in coming for the full meal deal, please see Mary Sheridan for Caregiver or Coastal Caregiver Resources. So I came across a card that reminded me of my mother a few years ago, and it was a quote from Edna St. Vincent Millay. And she said, it's not true that life is one damn thing after another. You open the card up and it says it's one damn thing over and over and over again. And I think most caregivers would tell you that the physical aspect of this job can be dreary, demanding, and sometimes it's downright disgusting. But as difficult as that is, it really doesn't even begin to compare with the emotional stress of caring for someone who is aging, chronically ill, disabled, or living with a cognitive brain injury or illness. So I think these 4 emotions are anger, guilt, depression, and grief. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, I think we've all experienced those. So Madelyn got angry often, and she got so angry at Quentin the first summer after his stroke. They had a wheat field fire, and he was having a terrible time walking, but he still believed that he could drive a tractor and he could drive a pickup, and that he really wanted to help with this wheat field fire. So she was heading toward the fire, and he was in the pickup with her, and he said, "Take me to the field where Larry was working earlier." And she said, "Well, what do you think you're going to do?" And he said, "I'm going to plow a fire break." And she said, "Well, I knew that was the right thing to do, but I sure didn't think he was the person to do it." She said, "As you know, since the stroke, his thinking processes are slower than molasses, and his right foot weighs about 900 pounds, which means you put him in anything that has a brake or a clutch or accelerator, and it's a pretty precarious situation." But he was insistent, and she let him go. And she said when she got to the field, there was a beehive of activity. There were people from the volunteer fire department, an ambulance had come out from town, people had just come off of the road and they were helping put it out. And she said there was this moment of absolute suspended silence when they saw Quentin driving his John Deere tractor down the road, and then he pulled it into the field, and he set his plow and he took off straight as an arrow. And she said, she had heard that most men consider their home their castle. And she said to Quentin, it was more of a rest stop. He would come to the house when it was time to eat, time to sleep, time to bathe. His castle was always a tractor. So they got the fire out. She called him on the businessman radio, and she said, "Crisis is over, Quentin, time to come home." And he said, "There's still some hot stubble. I think I'm just going to stay for a little bit." And she said, "I didn't think it was a good idea, but the idea of having a couple of hours all to myself in the house without him ringing his bell or listening to his talking books just sounded like such luxury." She let him stay. So he came in for supper at 6:30, sat down, ate, headed to the back door, and she said, "Where do you think you're going?" He said, "I'm just going to go back out and work just a little bit longer." She said she picked up the businessman radio at 8:30 and said, "Are you planning to work all night?" And he said, "No, I'll be in just a few minutes." And she said, "I'm not at all proud of myself, but when he finally came dragging in at 9:30, I met him at the back door hollering, 'If you have another stroke, it had better, by God, kill you!'" She said, "I went flouncing off to the living room, and he came following me in saying he was sorry, he just hadn't realized how late it had gotten." And I said, "Well, you know what? You don't have to be particularly smart to know that when the sun goes down and the moon comes up and the stars start to shine, that it's time to quit." She said, "I think I deserve to be angry with him and scared, because last year when he said he was retiring, he promised he wasn't going to work after supper or on Sunday anymore. And he still came dragging in around 10 or 11 o'clock every night, and I'm convinced that's the reason he had the stroke." And she said, "He hasn't had much energy since, and now who knows whether it's because he worked too hard and he wore himself out, or whether it's because he was reminded so forcibly that he can't live and work the way he has for the last 48 years. So did you get it that Madelyn was angry? Yeah, sure. And can you blame her? No. Her husband has had a stroke. It's not only changed his life, it has dramatically changed her life. She's afraid if he has another stroke, it could kill him. On the other hand, it might not. And if it doesn't kill him, it could injure him to the point that she could no longer care for him. Then she would be forced to sell the homesteaded farm ground. It would put my brother out of business, and there might not be any money left over to take care of her if she needed help. So she was scared. She was also frustrated because she could not control his behavior, she could not control his actions, and she was exhausted. These are the 3 F's of flipping out: fear, frustration, and fatigue. And she experienced all of these pretty much on a daily basis. I met a woman in Wisconsin a few years ago. I was speaking at a conference for caregivers of family members who had Parkinson's and Huntington's disease. And in the morning, I had talked about anger, and I had talked about how fatigue contributes to that. And at lunch, I sat with this group of ladies, and they were just delightful women. And the woman sitting next to me told me that she had it figured out. She knew how she was going to get some rest. And she told me this story, and then she allowed us to turn it into this little cartoon. So this is Claudia. I've got it all figured out. I'm going to rob a bank. I'm going to get my husband in the car, and we're going to drive to the bank, and we're going to park in front. And then I'm going to get him out, and I'm going to put him behind the wheel so that he'll look like the getaway driver. He'll be my accomplice. Then I'm going to walk in with an unloaded gun, and I'm going to point it at the teller, and I'm going to say, "This is a stick-up." And if she gives me any money, then I'm going to take it out to the car, and I'm going to sit in the passenger seat and wait for the police to come. Here's the beautiful thing about that. They'll arrest both of us, and they'll take him to the men's prison. Then they'll have to feed him. They'll have to do his laundry. They'll have to manage his medications. They'll have to deal with his depends. And then they'll take me to the women's prison. I will be in a cell all by myself. I'll be able to check books out of the library. I can read during the day, and I'll be able to sleep at night, and it won't cost us a dime. So does Claudia's plan make sense to any of you? Oh dear. Then really do get yourself involved if you aren't already in the Coastal Caregiving resources. She was doing a marvelous job of managing a very stressful situation by using humor. But I don't doubt for a second that she hadn't considered doing something desperate to get a little bit of rest. And anyone who has been caring for a family member, a loved one, over a long period of time knows that you can get so exhausted that you think, gosh, I wish I could just break a leg or get the flu and end up in the hospital so somebody would bring food to me. I see some head shaking out here. So, please figure out a way to get some respite to take care of yourself. So the next thing that I want to talk about is guilt. How many of you have had feelings of guilt? Okay, quite a few. So I'm going to take you through a workshop portion for guilt, because I think that the dictionary defines guilt as a sense of having done something wrong or having failed in an obligation. I think it is an emotion that is way overused by most caregivers. My mother, this is their 56th wedding anniversary. We took them back to the Paradise Inn up on Mount Rainier. You can see the impact that 5 years of caregiving has had on her here. And on the morning of their 56th wedding anniversary, it was a Sunday. And by this point, Quentin wasn't sleeping at night, which meant Madelyn wasn't sleeping at night. And he had fallen out of bed a number of times. And when she got up that morning, even though she knew it was going to be a very special service at church, there were going to be some former members and ministers. She knew there was going to be special music. And she suspected they would probably have an anniversary cake for them in the basement downstairs. But she simply did not have the physical or the emotional energy to get him ready that day. So she didn't even ask him if he wanted to go. She got him situated out in the garden, kind of in the sunshine, and as she was backing off of the driveway, she waved goodbye to him, and he kind of looked up and waved half-heartedly to her. By the time she got to the end of the driveway, she was feeling guilty, and she thought, oh, I could have gotten some of the big guys to come out. They would have helped get him out of the car and into the up the stairs into the church. They would have put him on the lift and gotten him to the sanctuary. They would have helped me get him downstairs. And she was really feeling bad. And she was so tired that, this guilt emotion was working on her heavy duty. And then the minister that day read a poem, and it's called Look at Me. And it was The author is unknown, but I've been told that it was found in the room of a woman who lived in a nursing home a few days after her funeral as the family was cleaning out her things. So look at me. What do you see, nurses? What do you see? What are you thinking when you're looking at me? A crabby old woman, not very wise, uncertain of habit with faraway eyes, who dribbles her food and makes no reply when you say in a loud voice, I do wish you'd try, who seems not to notice the things that you do, is forever losing a stocking or shoe, who, resisting or not, lets you do as you will, with bathing and feeding the long day to fill. Is that what you're thinking? Is that what you see? Then open your eyes, nurse. You're not looking at me. I'll tell you who I am as I sit here so still, as I use at your bidding, as I eat at your will. I'm a small child of 10 with a father and mother, brothers and sisters who love one another. A young girl of 16 with wings on her feet, dreaming soon that a lover she'll meet. A bride soon at 20. My heart gives a leap, remembering the vows that I promised to keep. At 25 now, I have young of my own, who need me to guide and secure a happy home. A woman of 30, my young now growing fast, bound to each other with ties that should last. At 40, my young sons have grown and are gone, but my man's beside me to see I don't mourn. At 50, once more a baby's play around my knee. Again we know children, my loved one and me. Dark days are upon me, my husband is dead. I look at the future, I shudder with dread. For my young are all rearing young of their own, and I think of the years and the love that I've known. I'm now an old woman, and nature is cruel. 'Tis just to make old age look like a fool. The body it crumbles, grace and vigor depart. There's now a stone where I once had a heart. But inside this old carcass a young girl still dwells, and now and again my battered heart swells. I remember the joys, I remember the pain, and I'm loving and living life all over again. I think of the years, all too few, gone too fast, and accept the stark fact that nothing can last. So open your eyes, nurses, open and see. Not a crabby old woman. Look closer, see me. Well, you can imagine. Thank you. You can imagine in her physical and emotional state, she started crying. And she went downstairs and she went up to Charles Prather, who's the beloved baritone of the Congregational Church, and she got right up in his face and she said, Charles, don't you dare sing Happy Anniversary to me. And he said, but Madelyn, I've already been told by 2 people to do it. And she said, if you do, I will lose it and I will never get it back. So she cried all the way home. And then she got Quentin into the kitchen table and they sat down and she cried and cried and cried, telling him how guilty she felt. And he said, I feel like crying too. But he didn't. Which surprised me because, as with most stroke survivors, he had a hair-trigger emotional switch. He'd be sitting there listening to his talking books, and if one of the characters, if he thought they were going to get in trouble, he would just sob. He could watch a commercial and cry like a baby. And here's my mother crying her heart out, and he said, I feel like crying too. And it took me several years. I guess I'm a slow learner, but one day it hit me. He was like, duh, of course he didn't cry. Because if she felt that guilty, guess what? She wasn't going to leave him at home alone anymore. She was either going to take him with her or she was going to stay there with him. And she was not going to leave him any longer. So then I ask you the question, is your guilt self-imposed or is it being imposed upon you by somebody else? So we're going to go through this little exercise and we're going to talk about how you can develop an attitude of creative indifference. So I would like for each of you to just think of a moment of an incident that made you feel a little guilty, okay? Can you put one incident in your mind? Okay. Then that's the first step, become aware of it. So listing it, naming it, thinking about it, and then determining who or what is your ball and chain. Are you imposing these feelings on yourself, or are they being imposed upon you by somebody else? In my parents' situation, I think it was both. I think they had a very well-established pattern of behavior. Dad was never mean. He never got angry, but he could feel so sorry for himself, and he could make Madelyn do things because she didn't want him to be sad. And I think it worked real well for him. So now I'd like for you to consider that guilt may or may not be an appropriate response. So how do you know if you're dealing with a guilt tripper? Here's a quick test. If something bad happens to you, ouch, is their primary concern for you, or do they only think about how inconvenient this is going to be for them? So, if they only think of themselves, it's a pretty good indication you're dealing with a guilt tripper. So, you say, why would they do this? Why would somebody intentionally make you feel guilty? Well, because it works. It's a very effective way of getting what they want. And getting what they want is all that matters. So as long as you are willing to do everything for everybody and accept the responsibility of endless tasks and wake up every day and just push that great big ball up the hill, then here's a big news flash. They're going to keep piling it on. They will never, ever say, stop. You're doing too much. You need to take care of yourself. You will never be able to do enough, give enough, be enough to satisfy a guilt tripper. They are always going to want more. So if you want it to stop, you're going to have to be the one who says, stop, I'm done with this. So now we're going to talk about some action steps. My husband Alex is out here. Wave, Alex. This is a saint. He's a wonderful, wonderful man, right? I am so fortunate. Wasn't always so fortunate. Many, many, many years ago, when I was young and stupid, I married a man who turned out to be a raging alcoholic. And he was the father of my children. And after 19 years, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. So I made an appointment to see a counselor. And when I went in, I said, how much time do we have? She said, you have 50 minutes. And I said, okay. She said, what do you want to accomplish? I said, in the next hour, then I want to know how I can get a divorce and make it okay for my 3 teenage children and my soon-to-be ex-husband. She says, okay. So I took a deep breath. And for the next 45 minutes, I told her how everybody was feeling, what everybody was doing, how it was impacting everyone. And at the end of the time, I said, oh, wow. I said, we're about out of time, aren't we? And she said, I'm just going to give you one piece of advice. And I said, okay, what's that? She said, get in your own shoes and stay in them. And I said, I don't think I understand. And she said, obviously. She said, you are so wrapped up in everybody else's feelings and wants and needs that you have no idea where your own feelings begin or end. She said, so get in your shoes and manage your feelings, and you let everybody else manage theirs. And I said, can I do that? And she said, you can. And I said, my husband is going to get so mad. And she said, let him. That's his choice. It's his response. It's up to him to manage his feelings. It's not up to you to manage his feelings. And that was like, I think I've just been let out of prison. So this is a key step. Stop taking on the responsibility for managing other people's feelings. And understand that you are one person and that there are limits to what you can do in taking care of other people. And this is the biggie here. I'm going to ask you to change your emotional vocabulary. And I want you to replace the word guilt with the word regret. So this is what guilt and shame feels like. It's like, ooh, you've really done something wrong. It's a personal failure on your part. You're a bad person for doing this, right? So regret is a sense of disappointment, and it's a wishing, it's a desire that things could be different, all right? So we're going to practice this, and instead of saying, I feel guilty, which would indicate that you've done something wrong, right? Say, I regret. So I regret that I sometimes have negative and angry feelings. I regret that I cannot change, fix, or control their situation. I regret that I resent the amount of time it takes to take care of them. I regret that I resent the amount of money that it takes, and that sometimes I think about how much something is going to cost before I think about the benefit to my care receiver. I regret that I sometimes run out of energy and I simply do not have the strength to do everything that needs to be done to take care of them. I regret that our relationship has changed. I regret that I don't enjoy our time together. I regret that I cannot keep all of the promises that I made in the past. And this is a big one. I regret that there are times I wish they would just die and get it over with. I regret a lot of things, but I don't do guilt anymore. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So then I would like for you to take another good look in the mirror. And I would like for you to think about all of the good, kind, and generous things you are doing to take care of your care receivers. And then I would like for you to think about how you would feel if someone was doing these things for you. And my guess is you would be grateful. Don't you think? Okay. So then I want you to give yourself credit, pat yourself on the back for being a good person, and let go of the times that maybe you aren't as saintly, as kind, as patient, as loving as you would like to be. And let go of those. Forgive yourself. And then here's the big thing. Summon up your courage. Because if you decide that you are going to stand up to guilt, when you say, I'm putting a stop to this, I'm not going on guilt trips any longer, I'm not going to respond to your anger or your guilt, then you know what they're going to do? They're going to get mad. They're going to get really, really mad. And they're going to pull every trick out of the book to try to pull you back into line. I see some smiles out here. You know this, don't you? So if you are tired of this, then you have to develop this attitude of creative indifference toward their emotions. And you have to be willing to let them be angry. Does that make sense? Does it sound scary? Does it sound possible? It takes practice. I read this book in the early 1990s, Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. I've probably read it 3 or 4 times since then, and I've given it to countless friends. This really will help you if you are controlled by someone who's trying to always make you feel guilty. This book can really help you. Also, this one, it's called Doing the Right Thing, Caring for Your Elderly Parents, Even If They Didn't Care for You. Oh, I hear some laughs. Somebody can identify with that. It's by Dr. Roberta Satow, and I think this book is phenomenal. And it doesn't, you may have fabulous parents, no issues with parents, but it really is an exceptionally good book in helping you learn to set boundaries and to take care of yourself. So I really recommend that. And then I really think that when you can stand up to guilt, that anger and guilt lose their power to control you. And when you refuse to be bullied and controlled then it's time to throw a party because that's really cause for celebration. So take a deep breath. Now, I want to talk to you about depression and grief. And I call these two the evil twins of caregiving because they look so much alike that it can be very difficult sometimes to tell one from the other. You get physical symptoms that are very similar. You can have stomach aches, tension, anxiety, panic attacks, headaches, backaches, all sorts of things, weight gain and loss. Most caregivers experience two different kinds of depression, maybe more, but the two that I'm very familiar with are reactionary depression and clinical depression. So reactionary depression is a result of an event, or it could be getting a bad diagnosis, it could be a pet dying, it could be a loss in a relationship. Clinical depression is different in that it is a medical problem that manifests itself in a mental disorder. And Madelyn experienced both. She was taking she called them little mood enhancers, and she got to feeling so good that she stopped taking them, and she said within about a week she just couldn't move. And she realized what was happening. She called, got her prescription renewed, and she got better. But this letter is one of my favorites, and I have cleaned it up for the benefit of this audience. But she went into a real bout of depression after buying this book. And this is what she said. Dear Elaine, I have been through several days of really miserable depression. And I think it all started with this stupid book, Simple Abundance. The woman is a young woman. She's much younger than I am. She has children that are still in grade school. But listen to this. What she's telling me I ought to do is I need to go to an artist supply store and I need to get a big artist sketchbook. And then I'm to take it home and I'm to take pages out of the sketchbook and I'm to put them up on my wall. And then I'm to sit down and go through magazines and find pictures of the types of homes that I'd like to live in. And I'm supposed to cut these out and then go paste those up on my artist sketchbook page. And then she says that I should go to a travel agency and look at brochures for the types of trips and adventures that I would like to have. And I'm supposed to take these brochures home and then put them up on my artist sketchbook page. Oh, and then I'm supposed to have a goodie drawer for scented candles and chocolate bonbons to get me through bad days. And doing these authentic things is going to help me get in touch with my authentic self. Good grief, my authentic self. Well, I got to thinking back to when I was her age, and we were too broke to quit farming. We had to build the grade A dairy status so we could continue to sell our milk, and I learned how to milk, and I hated every single minute I spent in that barn. And this was at the time that the women's liberation movement was just getting going, and I was reading articles about how men were becoming impotent because they were having to dry dishes. Well, I can tell you, as I was scooping manure out of that barn and sometimes spitting it out of my mouth, I did not have a lot of sympathy for those men. My thoughts were something like, oh, you poor babies. My heart just bleeds for you. We had never even heard the word bankruptcy, but even if we had, we would have never considered it. We just tightened our belts and we worked our way through it. And that's the same situation with Quentin's health right now, this is not what either one of us wanted. This is not what we planned for our lives or what we thought we were going to have at this stage. But I look back at that time when we were farming, and I was helping my husband accomplish his dream, and I was raising my children, and I was being my authentic self. And I feel like I'm being my authentic self now. But I can tell you, during those days of depression, I didn't want to do anything but sleep or read. And it didn't help anything at all when Quentin rolled out of bed 3 times in one night. He's happy to sit there during the day in his Depends and just go all day long sitting at the kitchen table as he's listening to his talking books. But then I put him to bed at night, I get a Depend on him, and then he forgets that he can't go to the bathroom by himself, and so he'll get that bed rail down somehow, and he'll sit on the side of the bed, and he'll think he's getting up to go, and then somehow he gets confused. He pulls down the Depend and the pajamas, and then he just lets her rip. And the 3rd time he did that, I got him up, I got him stripped out of his wet clothes, I put on a dry Depend, I got dry pajamas on him, I sat him down in the chair, I stripped the bed, I flipped the mattress, I remade the bed, I got him up there, I got him tucked back in, I pulled up the rail, and I got right up in his face, and I said, if I catch you sitting on the side of the bed again, I'm going to take a belt to you. I was mad as hell, and I deserved it. And then last night, as I was doing my exercises, the Bible verse came to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, come unto me, and I will give you rest. That was as far as I could get, but that just kept going through my mind over and over again, and this morning I woke up feeling like myself again. So, do you see how she kind of worked her way through that episode of reactionary depression? She identified what it was. She wrote about the situation that she believed sent her into this. And perhaps it was realizing that she would never have a new home, that she wasn't going to go on any exciting adventures in the near future. And maybe the reality of her situation caused her to feel depressed. She believed in a loving and benevolent God. And so her faith was a great resource for her. She also meditated. She listened to Deepak Chopra tapes. And at age 75, she became a certified Reiki instructor. So she was always looking for ways to boost her spirits and to learn something new and ways of managing her stress. And it's hard. It's a very difficult thing. And grief and depression, as I mentioned earlier, can look a lot alike. Normally when we think about grief, we associate it with the grief, the emotions, the journey that we go through after a loved one has died. But when you're caring for someone over a long term, someone who has a progressive and degenerative disease or a cognitive impairment, then we experience preparatory grief. And this is grieving losses of things that we used to do, that we used to enjoy. And it's grieving what we thought we were going to have at this particular point in life that we do not have. And it's also grieving losses that are still to come. Madelyn often said, my husband died on October 30th, 1993. We just haven't gotten around to burying him yet. She said that she felt like when a person was taking care of someone over a long period of time, that it could feel like that person was dead for as many years as you were caring for them. So this is not an easy process. This is a sadness and a longing for what was and never will be again. And one of the ways that she managed this was by focusing on who Quentin had been and finding some special moments when she felt tremendously loving toward him. And she would focus on these and try to recapture that feeling. And one of the things that exasperated her was the fact that he had been a workaholic farmer. You know, there was no challenge that was too great for him. And the stroke changed his personality. And he became depressed and despondent and uncooperative when it came to doing exercises. And she would try to convince him, she would cajole him, and she would try to coerce him into doing his exercises. He wouldn't do it. But then a friend recommended that he get some outside physical therapy. So when the pretty red-headed physical therapist would show up at the house, he would absolutely work his heart out for her. And he improved enough that they started going to an exercise class at the hospital. And in the beginning, Mom said, I don't know why we bother. She said, he can only do about half of the exercises. He can't do half of them at all, and the other half he does incorrectly, so I don't know if it's even worth the effort of getting in there. And she said, and the instructor is just so chatty. When we go in, she wants to know, how's everybody doing? What did you do over the weekend? What do you have planned for the day? And she said that she doesn't make them work, she just talks to them, most of the time. But he improved. And then one day he was able to walk from the car into the hospital without his cane. And everybody cheered him on. And I just want you to stop and think for a moment how that must have felt to him. He often talked about how he wanted to be with people and how he enjoyed company, except for the fact that he could no longer form what he wanted to say, the conversation in his mind. By the time he would form it, the conversations had moved on, and he couldn't even participate. And that was so depressing to him. And I know that my mother prayed every single day that she would be a willing channel for God's love and caring. She wrote that many, many times. And yet I know that there were times when he had to see in her eyes what she saw when she looked at him. And she said there were times that what she saw was just a repulsive old man and not at all the Quentin she had known and loved. So imagine how it must have felt to him to walk into that group and to have them cheering for him and praising him and telling him he was doing great. And today, when Ari took us on the tour of the hospital, I thought of this T-shirt. This was in my little gift bag last night, and I thought, you guys really get it. You understand that little things are not little. Being able to feed yourself without dropping all of the food down the front of your clothing. Being able to get out of the car and walk someplace without having to use the cane. Being able to go to the bathroom by yourself. These are things that most of us don't think about, but when we lose the ability, when we lose those skills, it's easy to lose our humanity. And I was so impressed, and I know that this hospital really helps people hang on to their dignity and regain their skills. And I'm just so pleased to have a little part of that, because I know that it makes a huge difference. Well, now for Quentin, once he could walk, he thought he could do some other things. And so I was very surprised. He also had prostate cancer. And the prostate cancer progressed. And he was, as I said, wearing adult diapers for about 4 years when I got this letter, which I thought was quite surprising. Have to catch up here just a second. Okay, so, dear Elaine, don't know if I have told you about Quentin's recent obsession with sex. Just out of the blue one morning, he turned to me at breakfast and he said, Madelyn, it occurs to me that you don't want to have sex with me anymore. And I said, that's right, Quentin, that part of our life is over. And then he said, well, if you're not willing to have sex with me, would it be okay with you if I had sex with somebody else? And I said, you know what? Just knock yourself out. I figured if he could find someone who is willing to have sex with him, she could just have all of him. She could deal with his wet depends. She could change his sheets in the middle of the night. She could pick him up off of the floor when he fell, and she could just have him all to herself. Good grief. Well, the next morning, he turned to me at breakfast, and he said, Madelyn, would you call Avis for me? He was not talking about the car rental company. He wanted me to call Avis, who's the girl that he took to his high school senior prom 60 years ago. Well, of course, I didn't want to call Avis, but that was all he could talk about all morning long. Have you called Avis? When are you going to call Avis? Why haven't you called Avis? Have you called Avis? When are you going to call Avis? Well, finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and I went to the phone, and I picked it up, and I called Avis. I did not tell her why Quentin wanted to see her. Well, it turns out Avis and her husband live in Wichita, about 50 miles away, and they were coming up to McPherson for a funeral on Saturday. And so I said, okay, well, why don't we meet at the Red Coach Inn for lunch? She said it sounded like a good idea, so we did. So when Avis came walking into the restaurant, she had her oxygen bottle strapped to her walker. I thought, okay, that'll take care of that. So we sat down, we had a nice lunch. I told Avis's husband about all of the things I was doing to make it easier to take care of Quentin. Like I had Greg come home and put the ceiling hoist in above the bed, so it makes it easier for me to lift him up to and out of bed. And I put a plastic pad like you see in offices underneath his table to make it easier for him to scoot up to and away from the table. And Avis's husband told me about all of the things that he was doing to make it easier to care for her, and thought, this is great. So we got in the car, and we were headed home, and I turned to Quentin and I said, so, what do you think of Avis now? And he said, I think she wants me. So this situation went on for months. Every 10 days to 2 weeks, I'd get another letter. And there would be a couple of sentences or a paragraph about Mom and Dad getting together with Avis. And honestly, I thought it was kind of funny. I didn't think it was anything to be overly concerned with until one morning I opened up a letter and I started reading, and Alex was sitting over at the breakfast table, and I said, listen to this. She said, speaking of jobs, which we weren't, I need for you to do something for me when you come home next week. I need for you to have the sex talk with your father. I thought, oh, good Lord, my dad is 80 years old. He's in adult diapers. We have never talked about sex. This is not a conversation I wanted to have. But my mother was exasperated. My brothers were mad at him. My sisters-in-law were disgusted, and so it fell to me. So I flew home, got Dad in the pickup, and we went for a drive to look at the crops, and I saw him looking wistfully out at a farmer driving his tractor in the field, and I said, Dad, I'm sorry you can't farm anymore. I know you really miss that. He said, I do. He said, but that's not the worst part. I said, really? What is? And he said, it's your mother. She's cut me off. I said, okay, well, here we go. So I pulled the pickup off to the side of the road. I switched off the ignition, and I said, Dad, now listen. The reason that you can't have sex is the same reason that you can't be out there driving a tractor. I said, it's your stroke and it's the prostate cancer, and you're not being nice to Mom. I said, she is working so hard to take care of you, and this is just disrespectful. And besides that, it takes a certain amount of physical dexterity to have sex, and you don't have it. You're a big man, she's a little woman, you could hurt her. And I said, and you haven't even thought about the logistics, for crying out loud. Mom would have to drive you to the hotel. Ava's husband would have to drive her to the hotel. Then what the heck do you think those two are going to be doing while you're in there trying to have sex? I mean, seriously, you think she's going to throw the ceiling hoist in her purse and come in and help you out? I said, no, stop it. Okay, I did not handle it well. I tried, but there were several things I didn't know at that time. My dad had stroke-related dementia. And there are a lot of strategies for dealing with people who have dementia. But I'm going to tell you 3 things tonight that will never work. These are the 3 don'ts of dementia. Do not argue, because you will not win. Their reality is as real to them as your reality is to you, and you cannot convince them otherwise. You will only upset, agitate, and aggravate them. Don't try to talk them out of it. No amount of reason will make them change their minds. And then don't force them to try to remember things that they have forgotten. Memories that are stolen do not return. So when you are dealing with someone who has dementia, try to step out of your reality and into yours. It will make it so much less frustrating for them and for you. My dad took a bad fall in April of 1999. He got up in the middle of the night, got disoriented, he fell, landed on their stationary bicycle, broke 7 ribs, and punctured a lung. It was a relief to me, to tell you the truth, because he finally was going to get the kind of medical attention that he needed. It wasn't a relief that he was hurt, but it was a relief that he was finally going to get some good medical care and that my mother was going to get some rest. 3 months later, she was sitting there with him. She had given him permission to die. She had kissed him. She told him she loved him, and she was holding his hand when he took his last breath. I have a wonderful story to tell you about hospice, but we don't have time to do this tonight. So come to the workshop on Wednesday if you can, because hospice can help people at the end of their lives control the pain and end their lives with dignity and without fear. And I want to leave you with a story that I thought of about a year after my dad died. Mom and I were talking on the phone one day, and she said, you know, if I could only use one word to describe our 56 years of marriage, that word would be laughter. And I was like, laughter? Seriously? You know, I would have expected love, commitment, perseverance, endurance, but laughter. And then I thought about a story. Have any of you ever listened? Did you used to listen to Garrison Keillor, Prairie Home Companion? Okay, so I've borrowed this from the joke show. You may recognize it, but I've adapted it to Madelyn and Quentin. I can imagine that they would be sitting at breakfast one morning, and Quentin would turn to her and he'd say, boy, Madelyn, you and I have really been together for a long time. And she would say, we certainly have. And he would say, we've been through a lot together. She'd say, yes, we have. He'd say, you were there with me the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. Yes, I was. And you were there the day that the storm came through and took the roof off of the barn, and all of our crops were destroyed. Yes, I was. And you were there the day that our oldest and youngest son both got orders for Vietnam on the same afternoon. Yeah, that was a tough one. And you were there when Greg flew his crop duster airplane into the telephone pole. Yeah, that was pretty scary. And you were there when our folks, both sets of folks, got sick and had to be cared for 10 years. That was tough. And you know, Madelyn, when I had my stroke and I looked up, your face is the first face I saw. She'd say, yeah, that's right, Quentin, I guess it was. And then he'd say, you know, Madelyn, I love you with my whole heart, but I'm starting to think you might be bad luck. So my hope for all of you here is that when you come to the end of your caregiving journey, whether you are a family caregiver or you are a professional caregiver, and you look back on this time in your life and everything that you have done to care for others, I hope that, like Madelyn, what you will remember is the laughter more than the tears. So thank you so much.